You think you understand how power operates in the flashy tech scene of Austin, Texas. You picture 20-year-old boys in hoodies, throwing millions of dollars into crypto startups and partying on rented yachts. You are completely wrong. Real power never screams on social media. It is quiet, patient, and records everything in the dark. Listen closely, because I am going to show you what really happens when arrogant brats dare to trample on the woman who built their empire. Hello to the wonderful audience of Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and continue creating stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments below. My name is Taylor Evans. I am 38 years old, and I am the Director of Data Systems at EtherDim, a financial technology company currently valued at $2 billion right here in Austin, Texas. I am the invisible ghost haunting this miniature Silicon Valley. I am the one who wrote the core algorithm that breathes life into the company, the complex neural network that processes millions of microtransactions in fractions of a second. Every single dollar that flows through EtherDim relies on the architecture I coded by hand in my modest apartment 4 years ago. Yet, if you search for my name in the glossy tech magazines or the viral business blogs, you will find absolutely nothing. I do not exist in their world. I prefer perfectly tailored, muted wool trousers over neon designer streetwear. I refuse to create social media profiles, and I have always coldly declined to participate in the ridiculous, champagne-soaked networking retreats hosted by the newly rich. The spotlight, instead, is blindingly focused on Julian. Our esteemed Chief Executive Officer is 23 years old. The financial media worships the ground he walks on, constantly splashing his face across their covers and hailing him as a quote-unquote billion-dollar genius. But I see the raw data, and the reality is nauseating. Julian has never written a single line of usable code. He is an arrogant, silver-tongued parasite whose only true talent is siphoning venture capital funds to finance a lifestyle that would make a royal family blush. He burns through investor cash on private helicopter rides, weekend trips to private islands, and luxury cars, all while preaching about disrupting the global economy. Tonight is the ultimate manifestation of his vanity. It is the grand launch gala for our new super application, held at the Obsidian Vault. It is the most expensive and exclusive convention center in the city, an enormous cavern of black marble, towering glass, and suffocating ambition. Out in the main hall, the air is thick with the smell of expensive perfumes and the desperate energy of people trying to prove they belong to the top 1%. But I am not out there sipping vintage wine. I am standing in the cramped, dimly lit technical area directly behind the main stage. Yesterday afternoon, Julian personally crossed my name off the VIP guest list. He pulled me aside in the hallway, flashing that perfectly practiced, arrogant smirk. "We need to keep the aesthetics sharp for the cameras tonight. Taylor," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You understand, right? Try not to ruin the formation. Just stay in the back with the tech crew and make sure the screens do not glitch." He banished me to the shadows because my conservative wardrobe and quiet demeanor did not fit the narrative of his wild, youthful tech empire. He thought I would be crushed by the humiliation. He thought I would quietly accept my place as the aging workhorse hidden behind the curtain. He was profoundly mistaken. As I stand here in the dark, listening to the low, rhythmic hum of the server cooling fans, I am perfectly at peace. The young technicians rush around me, sweating and panicking over cable connections, but I remain entirely still. I welcome this darkness. It gives me the privacy to slide my hand into the pocket of my blazer and trace the cold, metallic edges of a small USB drive. That drive contains exactly 3 years and 4 months of unredacted, deeply incriminating data. It holds the cryptographic proof of every shell company Julian set up, It contains the exact timestamps of every dollar he diverted from the company treasury into his offshore accounts. It is the digital equivalent of a loaded gun, and my finger is resting firmly on the trigger. I am not standing backstage out of submission. I am simply counting down the minutes. For the past 6 months, I have been quietly laying out a flawless, inescapable trap. I have not done it alone. I have been coordinating every move with a very quiet, immensely powerful private equity firm based out of Chicago. Tonight is not a celebration of Julian's genius. It is a meticulously choreographed execution. He thought he was hiding an embarrassing employee in the back room, but in reality, he gave the architect of his destruction the perfect vantage point to watch his entire empire burn to the ground. Through the slight parting of the heavy black velvet curtains, I watched the circus of narcissists assemble. The obsidian vault had been transformed into an overwhelming sensory assault. The air was thick with a suffocating blend of expensive oud perfume, spilled vintage champagne, and the electric, desperate hum of relentless networking. Hundreds of guests swarmed the expansive floor, creating a chaotic mix of the new tech aristocracy. There were middle-aged venture capitalists desperately trying to cling to their youth, wearing aggressively tailored suits paired with $1,000 sneakers. They huddled in tight, paranoid circles, loudly pitching decentralized finance platforms that produced absolutely nothing of actual, tangible value. Then there were the young crypto investors, loud and frantic, sweating through their silk shirts as they constantly checked the fluctuating markets on their glowing screens. Weaving through all of them like a swarm of perfectly manicured locusts were the social media stars. They held up portable ring lights, live streaming every agonizingly fake smile and rehearsed laugh. The noise was a deafening wall of empty buzzwords: disruption, paradigm shift, scalability. It was a grand masquerade ball for frauds, and everyone in the room was secretly terrified of being unmasked. Then, the massive main doors swung open, and the ambient noise dropped to an expectant, reverent hush. The king had arrived. Julian strode into the hall bathed in a tracking spotlight, soaking in the applause as if he had personally saved humanity. He was draped in an unstructured, avant-garde designer jacket that undoubtedly cost more than the annual salary of his lowest-paid data engineers. Clinging tightly to his left arm was his newly acquired prize, his fiancée of exactly 3 months, Chloe. She was 21 years old and possessed the kind of manufactured, flawless beauty that required entire teams of professionals to maintain. Her entire claim to fame, her massive online empire, was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated cruelty. She was an influencer who had made her fortune by posting reaction videos, brutally mocking the outfits, homes, and lifestyles of regular people who could not afford her level of luxury. Tonight, she wore a heavily beaded gown that looked like it was made of liquid silver, reflecting the flashing camera lights like a human disco ball. She held her phone up, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd, likely searching for her next digital victim. Together, standing in the center of the room, they looked like the perfect modern power couple, radiant and wealthy. Yet, beneath the designer fabrics and the blinding smiles, they were entirely hollow. They were nothing more than beautifully painted empty shells, desperate to convince the world that they possessed actual substance. The grand entrance was supposed to smoothly transition into a monumental promotional presentation on the massive digital wall dominating the main stage. The music swelled, a pounding, aggressive electronic beat designed to rattle the ribs of every investor in the building. Julian raised his hand, a dramatic, practiced gesture signaling the control booth to roll the introductory footage. Instead of a high-definition rendering of our new application, the massive screen violently flickered, flashed a blinding, nauseating shade of green, and then went completely black. The pulsing music abruptly cut off, replaced by the horrifying, heavy sound of absolute silence sweeping across the cavernous room. Backstage, the technical area instantly devolved into sheer, uncoordinated panic. 4 young technicians, fresh out of college and terrified for their careers, scrambled over the complex mixing boards, shouting contradictory commands at each other in high-pitched voices. Before I could even sigh at their incompetence, the walkie-talkie clipped to my belt crackled to life. Julian's voice pierced through the static, completely stripped of his usual charming, charismatic public persona. "What is going on back there?" Julian hissed through the earpiece, his voice trembling with barely contained, vicious rage. "I am standing out here looking like a complete idiot in front of the board. Get the data girl to fix it. Hey, Taylor, are you actually doing anything useful back there? Or are you just taking up space? Fix this right now. Or I swear I will have security throw you out of this building and I will blacklist you from every tech firm in this entire state. Do your job, you useless hack." He spoke to me not as the brilliant architect of his wealth, but as an easily replaceable, incompetent intern. The panicked technicians froze in their tracks, staring at me with wide, fearful eyes, waiting to see how the aging, quiet outcast would react to being publicly degraded and threatened over the radio. I did not flinch. I did not hurry. I simply stepped out from the deep shadows of the towering server racks. I was wearing my custom-tailored, vintage charcoal tweed suit. The heavy textured fabric felt like impenetrable armor against the hysterical, panicked energy buzzing around me. I walked calmly past the frantic young men, my low-heeled leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the bare concrete floor. I reached the master control console, completely bypassed the clunky visual interface they were frantically fighting with, and opened the root command terminal. My fingers moved across the glowing keyboard with the cold, calculated precision of a surgeon. I typed 3 lines of raw override code, seamlessly rerouted the visual data feed through the secondary server cluster, and pressed the execution key. The entire process took exactly 10 seconds. The massive screen behind Julian roared back to life, perfectly displaying the rotating, high-definition gold logo of the new application. The crowd erupted into cheers, completely unaware of the catastrophic failure that had just been narrowly averted. On the monitors, I saw Julian exhale visibly, aggressively puffing his chest out again as if he had personally willed the complex technology to work through sheer force of his own charisma. Back in the dim booth, the young technicians backed away from the console, staring at me in stunned, reverent silence. I stepped back into the shadows, slowly smoothing a minor, invisible crease in my heavy tweed jacket. I looked out through the gap in the velvet curtains at Julian and Chloe, watching them bask in the unearned adoration of the wealthy crowd. They were dancing frantically in the spotlight, desperately trying to keep their fragile illusion alive. I simply watched them from the dark, perfectly still. I was a patient predator studying the erratic, foolish movements of its prey, knowing with absolute, comforting certainty that the trap was perfectly set. The steel jaws were wide open, and it was only a matter of time before they stepped inside. The crucial moment of the evening was rapidly approaching. Julian and Chloe positioned themselves at the bottom of the glowing, translucent glass stairs leading up to the main podium. This was the crescendo of the entire event, the final desperate plea for the Series D funding round. Julian needed to step up to that podium and convince the board of directors and the largest shareholders in the room to part with another $250 million. Without that massive injection of capital, his carefully constructed house of cards would completely collapse within 48 hours. To ensure perfect audio transmission for his critical pitch, I had left the safety of the backstage booth and moved to the edge of the main floor. I stood partially concealed behind a massive, towering floral arrangement of white orchids, holding a spare digital walkie-talkie. I was quietly monitoring the frequency channels to prevent any further audio feedback loops. A few yards away, Chloe was holding a full crystal goblet of vintage, deep red wine. She was gesturing wildly as she laughed with a group of cryptocurrency promoters. She was posing for a live video broadcast, completely absorbed in her own glowing digital reflection on her phone screen. She was not paying attention to her surroundings when a frantic waiter, carrying a heavy silver tray of appetizers, accidentally bumped into her elbow. It was a microscopic collision, a brief brush of fabric, but the physics of the accident were absolutely devastating. the heavy crystal goblet tipped forward in her hand. A dark, violent splash of burgundy liquid erupted from the glass and rained directly across the front of her custom, expensive liquid silver gown. The heavy, intricately beaded fabric instantly soaked up the dark stain, making it look as though she had been severely struck in the chest. For 2 entire seconds, the young influencer simply stared down at the ruined beads in absolute shock. Then, she unleashed a piercing, high-pitched screech that violently cut through the ambient noise of the entire convention hall. She threw the empty crystal glass violently onto the black marble floor, where it shattered into 100 jagged pieces. She began stomping her feet, screaming viciously at the terrified waiter. Her carefully curated, elegant persona instantly dissolved into the raw, unfiltered, and deeply ugly tantrum of a spoiled child. The surrounding guests instinctively backed away, forming a wide circle around her meltdown. In her blind, humiliated rage, Chloe needed a target. She snatched the wireless microphone directly from Julian's hand. The microphone was already live, connected directly to the massive line-array speakers suspended from the high ceiling. She spun around, frantically looking for someone, anyone, to clean up the disaster and absorb her fury. That was when her manic eyes locked directly onto me. I was standing quietly just a few yards away, wearing my vintage charcoal tweed suit, holding the radio equipment, her face twisted into a mask of pure, vindictive cruelty. She raised a perfectly manicured, trembling finger and pointed it straight at my chest. "Hey, Grandma!" Chloe screamed into the live microphone. The volume was deafening. The amplified sound waves physically vibrated the floorboards and echoed violently against the black marble walls. Every single head in the cavernous room snapped in our direction. Thousands of eyes locked onto me. "You, the ancient assistant," she continued, her voice heavily distorted and impossibly shrill through the amplification system. "Get over here and get me a towel right now. Look at you. Standing there doing absolutely nothing. You look like you stepped out of the last century. Hurry up and clean this mess up before my followers see this total disaster." The entire hall went completely, horrifyingly dead silent. The pulsing background music had been cut by the panicked sound engineers. The low murmurs of the wealthy crowd had ceased entirely. The only sound was the faint, electric hiss of the active speakers. Then, from the VIP tables near the front of the stage, a sharp, ugly bark of laughter erupted. It came from Chloe's massive entourage of fellow social media influencers. Within seconds, that single laugh multiplied into a chorus of cruel, mocking giggles rippling rapidly through the wealthy crowd. They were pointing at my modest clothes. They were looking at me as if I were a piece of discarded trash that had somehow wandered into their exclusive, glittering sanctuary. This was modern cyberbullying dragged out into the physical world, a brutal, public execution of a person's dignity. I slowly shifted my gaze to Julian. This was the man whose company I had built from absolutely nothing. This was the man whose entire fortune rested on the complex algorithms I had painstakingly written. I waited for just a moment to see if he possessed even a single microscopic fraction of human decency. I waited to see if he would defend the person who made his luxurious life possible. He did not. Instead of taking the microphone away from his deranged fiancée, Julian glared at me with sheer panic and intense annoyance. "Well, you heard her. Taylor," Julian shouted loudly over the chuckles of the investors, waving his hands frantically at me as if swatting away a fly. "Do not just stand there staring like a complete idiot. Get a cloth. Get some club soda. Move. We are going live with the pitch in exactly 2 minutes, and you are ruining the schedule. Clean it up right now." This was the exact moment they expected me to break. They wanted me to flush red with profound embarrassment, drop my eyes to the floor in shame, and scurry away in tears like a deeply humiliated servant. They wanted to feed my dignity to their ravenous, bottomless egos. Instead, I felt a deep, icy wave of absolute calm wash over my entire body. I did not frown. I did not glare. I did not rush. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored tweed vest and slowly pulled out a pristine, heavily starched white cotton handkerchief. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement and walked directly into the blinding tracking spotlight that the lighting crew had swung over to illuminate Chloe's public meltdown. My posture was perfectly straight. My footsteps were slow, measured, and entirely devoid of fear. The laughter in the room began to nervously taper off as I approached. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy and uncomfortable. There was something in my quiet demeanor that deeply unsettled them. A cold, predatory confidence that completely defied the public humiliation they were eagerly trying to conduct. I stopped mere inches from Chloe. Her chest was heaving heavily, her eyes wide with manic, entitled rage. I calmly held out the immaculate white square of cotton, as she angrily snatched it from my fingers with a frustrated huff. I leaned forward. I let a slow, bone-chillingly cold smile spread across my lips. I brought my face so close to the side of her head that I could smell the sharp, sour scent of the alcohol evaporating off her ruined dress. I did not use the microphone. I kept my voice so incredibly low and steady that only the two of us existed in that specific acoustic space. I strongly suggest you enjoy this final glass of wine, my dear, I whispered softly into her ear. My tone as smooth and hard as polished glass. Because by this time tomorrow, the federal authorities will have frozen every single one of your joint bank accounts, and federal prison jumpsuits do not come with sequins. I pulled back slowly and looked directly into her eyes. The physical transformation was instantaneous and absolutely magnificent to witness. The vicious, arrogant fire in her eyes was instantly extinguished, completely replaced by a sudden, paralyzing terror. The color violently drained from her flawless, heavily contoured face, leaving her skin a sickly, ashen gray. Her jaw went completely slack. The white handkerchief slipped out from her trembling fingers, landing silently on the puddle of spilled wine at our feet. She could not breathe. She could not speak. She simply stared at me, her chest frozen. Realizing, in one horrifying, heart-stopping second, that she had just screamed at the executioner who was already swinging the axe toward her neck. I gave her one final, perfectly polite nod. Then, I turned my back on the frozen, terrified girl and walked slowly back into the comforting shadows to watch the imminent, catastrophic storm finally make landfall. Julian completely ignored his shivering fiancée. He bounded up the illuminated glass steps with the practiced agility of a predator closing in on its final kill. He gripped the edges of the transparent podium, leaning forward into the primary microphone. The room instantly fell into a captivated silence, eagerly awaiting the sermon of their false prophet. This was his grand finale. He was confidently preparing to announce the immediate sale of 40% of the company's shares to a massive, unnamed global investment consortium. The proposed valuation was astronomical. If this deal closed tonight, he would personally pocket hundreds of millions of dollars, cashing out his equity and leaving the rest of the board holding a hollow, rotting shell. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's amplified voice boomed across the cavernous hall, dripping with artificial humility and toxic charisma. "Tonight, we are not just launching an application, we are redefining the very architecture of global finance. We have seen unprecedented, staggering growth over the past 4 quarters, and tonight, I am thrilled to show you the trajectory of our inevitable future." He raised his right hand dramatically, holding a sleek black wireless remote. He flashed a blinding manufactured smile at the crowd of hungry investors. He pressed the button. He fully expected the massive 50-foot screen behind him to ignite with a beautifully fabricated soaring bar chart depicting fake revenue numbers. From my position in the shadows, my hand was still resting deep inside my tailored tweed pocket. My thumb found the small, tactile switch I had discreetly soldered onto the circuit board of the modified radio transmitter. Exactly half a second after Julian pressed his clicker, I pressed mine. I deployed the payload. The grand symphony of his absolute destruction began with a single, jarring digital screech. The soaring electronic background music violently cut out, The massive digital screen behind the podium instantly froze on a horrifying, corrupted grid of neon green pixels. Julian tapped his clicker again, his smile faltering for a microscopic fraction of a second. He tapped it a third time, much harder, the plastic cracking slightly under his thumb. "It seems we have a slight technical delay. Folks," Julian chuckled nervously into the microphone, sweat instantly forming on his perfectly powdered forehead. "Just give our brilliant engineering team a moment." The screen did not show the Golden Company logo. It did not show the fake revenue projections. Instead, with a deafening metallic crash that echoed through the primary speakers, the display shifted to a stark, blindingly bright white background. A heavily redacted document materialized on the screen, magnified to the size of a two-story building. It was an official banking statement from a notorious offshore tax haven in the Cayman Islands. A collective, confused gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite guests. Julian turned his head, looking over his shoulder. The color violently evacuated his face. Before he could even process the image, the screen shifted again, moving with the rapid, merciless tempo of a ticking time bomb. Snap! A highly confidential email appeared, detailing a systematic plan to forge the user acquisition metrics by over 75%. Snap. Another document exploded onto the display. It was an internal ledger, heavily highlighted in glowing red, showing exact wire transfers. $8 million moved from the corporate payroll account directly into a private shell company registered exclusively under Julian's personal name. Snap. $12 million transferred to a luxury real estate holding firm. Snap. $5 million wired to an anonymous cryptocurrency wallet just 48 hours prior to this gala. The scrolling was relentless. It was an overwhelming, unavoidable avalanche of undeniable financial treason. Extortion emails, forged signatures, desperate messages from bullied accountants who had been threatened with termination if they did not cook the books. Every single dirty, buried secret Julian had created over the last 3 years was currently being broadcast in ultra-high definition to the very people he was actively trying to rob. The sheer scale of the fraud was paralyzing. Then, the paralysis broke, and absolute, feral panic erupted. The main floor devolved into a chaotic riot of terrified billionaires. Venture capitalists began screaming at the top of their lungs, hurling their crystal champagne flutes to the marble floor. Men in expensive suits shoved each other out of the way, desperately grabbing their phones to call their legal teams and demand immediate halts on all wire transfers. The elegantly dressed crowd transformed into an angry, vicious mob. "Fraud!" a prominent hedge fund manager roared from the front row, his face purple with rage. "You stole our money. I want my funds frozen right now." Julian backed away from the podium, his breathing rapid and shallow. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the violently hostile room. His empire was disintegrating in real time, in his blind panic. His eyes frantically searched the perimeter until they locked onto me. I was still standing perfectly still in the shadows, watching him drown. His fear instantly mutated into a cornered, desperate fury. "It is her!" Julian shrieked into the live microphone, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail. He pointed a trembling, desperate finger directly at me. "She hacked the mainframe. It is a deep fake. She is trying to sabotage the firm. Security. Get security over here right now. Arrest her. Drag her out of this building." 4 massive, broad-shouldered private security contractors immediately broke away from their perimeter posts. They wore dark tactical uniforms and carried themselves with threatening, violent intent. They charged past the screaming investors, their heavy boots thudding aggressively against the marble floor, moving directly toward my position. I did not take a single step back. I simply kept my eyes locked on Julian, waiting for the final crescendo. The security guards were less than 10 feet away, their hands reaching out to aggressively grab my arms. Suddenly, the massive, towering obsidian doors at the very back of the convention hall did not just open, they were violently thrown open, crashing heavily against the exterior walls with a sound like a thunderclap. The heavy thud echoed above the screaming crowd, so powerful and commanding that the charging security guards instinctively froze in their tracks. Turning their heads toward the entrance, a perfectly synchronized phalanx of individuals walked into the chaotic room. There were 12 of them, men and women dressed in impeccably tailored, razor-sharp black suits. They moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose, a pack of corporate wolves entering a pen of panicked sheep. The terrified guests instantly parted, scrambling out of their way, desperately pressing themselves against the walls to avoid the imposing formation. Leading the pack was a woman who required absolutely no introduction in the ruthless world of high finance. It was Victoria Vance. She was the undisputed, notoriously brutal female chief executive officer of the most terrifying private equity firm in Chicago. She wore a severe, double-breasted charcoal blazer, her silver hair pulled back into an uncompromisingly tight knot. She exuded a suffocating aura of absolute authority. She did not walk. She marched. Julian gripped the podium, a microscopic glimmer of delusional hope flashing across his terrified face. He foolishly thought the cavalry had arrived to save his catastrophic deal. He opened his mouth to speak to her. Victoria Vance did not even glance in his direction. She completely ignored the panicked chief executive, treating him as if he were nothing more than a stain on the marble floor. She marched directly through the parted crowd, slicing through the chaos, and walked straight toward the shadows where I stood. The hulking security guards hurriedly backed away, thoroughly intimidated by the sheer gravity of her presence. Victoria stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. The screaming in the hall began to abruptly die down, replaced by a stunned, deeply confused silence as hundreds of people watched the most powerful woman in the room halt before the invisible, plainly dressed data engineer. Victoria squared her shoulders, looked me directly in the eyes, and then, in front of the entire assembly of billionaires, board members, and screaming media influencers, she slowly and deliberately bowed her head to me in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. The sound of Victoria Vance walking up the illuminated glass stairs was the only rhythm left in the massive, suffocating room. She did not rush. Every single step she took was a deliberate, heavy strike against the fragile glass floor of Julian's manufactured reality. Julian was still standing behind the transparent podium, his knuckles completely white from gripping the edges, his breathing ragged and shallow. As Victoria approached him, his desperate, panicked mind desperately tried to assemble a final, pathetic defense. He reached out his hand, a trembling, sweaty gesture of partnership, a foolish boy expecting a titan to save him from his own catastrophic failures. Victoria did not even look at his extended hand. She stepped directly into his personal space, her physical presence so overwhelmingly dominant that Julian instinctively shrank back, his shoulders caving inward. She reached out and smoothly pried the wireless microphone from his violently shaking fingers. Julian opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to lie, but the look in Victoria's cold, unblinking eyes immediately silenced him. She turned her back on him completely, facing the chaotic sea of enraged investors, panicked board members, and stunned social media influencers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I require your absolute silence," Victoria commanded into the microphone. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying, resonant gravity that instantly cut through the screaming and the chaos. Within 5 seconds, the riotous hall fell into an eerie, graveyard hush. Even the furious hedge fund managers stopped their shouting, their eyes locked on the legendary executive. "Julian," Victoria began, her tone carrying the clinical detachment of a surgeon observing a terminal disease. She did not turn to look at him. She spoke entirely to the crowd, broadcasting his humiliation to the world. "You stood on this stage tonight under the arrogant assumption that my private equity firm was here to finalize the purchase of 40% of the equity in EtherDim. You assumed you were about to walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital to fund your continued financial crimes." Victoria paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the weight of her next words. "You assumed incorrectly. My firm is not purchasing a single share of EtherDim. We never intended to. Because, as of this exact moment, Etherdim is completely worthless. Julian let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, clutching his chest as if he had been physically struck. The crowd erupted into confused, panicked murmurs. Worthless. How could a company valued at $2 billion be entirely worthless in the span of a single evening? Victoria lowered the microphone slightly and gestured toward the shadows where I was standing. I will let the actual owner of this empire explain the mechanics of your destruction. This was my cue. I stepped out of the darkness for the final time. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored tweed blazer and walked calmly up the glass stairs. I did not look at the ruined man shivering near the podium. I walked directly to Victoria, who handed me the microphone with a deeply respectful nod. I turned to face the thousands of powerful individuals who, just 20 minutes ago, had laughed at me and called me a washed-up, ancient relic. Now, they stared up at me with absolute, unadulterated fear. For the past 4 years, the financial media has endlessly praised Julian for building a revolutionary data processing algorithm. I spoke clearly, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. You poured your wealth into this company because you believed Etherdim owned the proprietary technology that processes billions of transactions a day. You believed the lie he sold you. I turned my head slowly, finally locking eyes with Julian. His face was a mask of absolute horror, his eyes wide and unblinking, the realization slowly clawing its way up his throat. The truth, I continued, my voice echoing violently off the black marble walls, is that Etherdim does not own a single line of that code. Exactly 4 years and 2 months ago, entirely before Julian ever filed the incorporation papers for Etherdim, I legally registered and patented the core neural network architecture under a completely separate, anonymous private holding company of my own creation. I am the sole proprietor of the intellectual property. A collective, massive gasp ripped through the audience. The realization was hitting the seasoned investors like a physical shockwave. Julian, I said, addressing him directly now, letting the entire room hear the final nail being driven into his coffin. Your entire company never owned the engine. You merely operated on a non-exclusive, highly restricted usage license. A license that, if you had ever bothered to read the actual legal contracts instead of spending your days partying on rented yachts, clearly states it can be immediately and permanently revoked by the owner in the event of any documented financial fraud. I pointed directly at the massive screen behind us, which was still displaying the undeniable proof of his offshore shell companies and embezzled millions. The fraud has been documented, I declared ruthlessly. The license is permanently terminated. Etherdim no longer has a product. It no longer has a service. What you hold in your hands, Julian, is nothing but an empty, rotting legal shell burdened with hundreds of millions of dollars in massive liabilities, furious creditors, and zero actual assets. I turned back to the crowd, my voice rising in power, delivering the ultimate, earth-shattering twist. Victoria Vance and her firm did not come here to buy shares of an empty, fraudulent company. Yesterday morning, her private equity group purchased the exclusive, perpetual licensing rights to the algorithm directly from my private holding company for $850 million in cash. The hall absolutely exploded. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. The investors were not just shouting, they were roaring. They realized instantly that their money was entirely gone, burned in Julian's vanity bonfire. But the real power, the actual technology, was completely safe, locked away in the hands of the quiet woman standing on the stage and the ruthless titan from Chicago standing beside her. At the front, VIP table. The primary board of directors for Etherdim went into an absolute, frantic frenzy. These were old, wealthy men who understood the terrifying reality of accomplice liability. If they went down with Julian, they would spend the rest of their natural lives in federal prison. The chairman of the board, a man in a wrinkled tuxedo, grabbed a pen and a linen napkin. He began frantically writing out an emergency executive resolution. He forced the other board members to violently scribble their signatures on the stained cloth. He stood up, shoving his chair backward so hard it crashed to the floor, and held the napkin high in the air. The board unanimously votes to terminate Julian as chief executive officer. Effective immediately, the chairman screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure terror. We disavow all his actions. We are cooperating fully with the authorities. They threw him to the wolves to save their own necks. Julian was no longer a tech genius. He was not even an employee. He was a trespasser in a building paid for by the money he stole. Down on the main floor, the reality of the situation finally penetrated the thick, superficial skull of his fiancée. Chloe stood frozen amidst the screaming investors, her silver dress still stained with the dark, foul-smelling spilled wine. She looked up at the stage, at the man she had planned to marry. She did not see a billionaire anymore. She saw a broke, deeply indebted criminal who was guaranteed to spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. The manufactured love she claimed to have for him evaporated faster than water on a hot skillet. With frantic, trembling fingers, Chloe gripped the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring on her left hand. She ripped it off her finger with such violent force that it scraped her skin. She threw the heavy ring onto the marble floor, completely abandoning the sinking ship. She turned on her high heels, intending to sprint out the side exit and disappear into the night before the cameras could capture her association with a convicted felon. She made it exactly 5 steps. The heavy side doors burst open, and a wall of grim-faced men and women flooded into the corridor. They were wearing dark tactical windbreakers with 3 massive, bright yellow letters printed across their backs: Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent, a tall man with a severe expression, stepped directly into Chloe's path. She slammed into his chest, bouncing off him and stumbling backward in her expensive heels. "Nobody leaves this building," the federal agent commanded loudly, holding up a thick stack of federal warrants. He looked down at the terrified influencer. "We have warrants to seize all devices, freeze all accounts, and detain all primary associates connected to the EtherDim financial fraud investigation." Chloe let out a pathetic, breathless whimper as a female agent stepped forward, firmly gripping her arm and pulling her aside for interrogation. Her digital empire, her wealth, her entire arrogant existence was completely erased in a matter of seconds. Up on the stage, the psychological weight of the absolute destruction finally crushed Julian completely. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto his knees, striking the hard glass floor with a dull thud. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. His face was buried in his hands, and he was sobbing loudly. The pathetic, wet sounds of a broken boy who had finally been caught playing a game he never truly understood. I stood towering over him. The heavy, chaotic noise of the room faded into the background. I looked down at the top of his shaking head. I reached up and unclipped the cheap plastic EtherDim employee badge that he had forced me to wear earlier that evening. I let it drop. The plastic badge hit the glass floor right directly between his trembling hands, the sharp clatter forcing him to look up. His eyes were red, swollen, and filled with an endless, agonizing despair. He looked up at me, the invisible architect who had patiently built his throne and then methodically, flawlessly dismantled it beneath him. I stared down into his tear-streaked face. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression entirely devoid of pity. "Next time," I said smoothly, my voice cold, calm, and carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of a true conqueror, "do not call your creditor Grandma." Exactly 1 week after the catastrophic launch gala, the atmosphere inside the towering downtown high-rise had completely transformed. The loud, obnoxious neon logo of EtherDim that once dominated the main lobby wall had been unceremoniously torn down, leaving faint scuff marks on the pristine marble. In its place, a sleek, understated plaque made of brushed steel was quietly bolted to the wall. It bore the name of the new holding company, the firm that I now formally chaired alongside Victoria Vance. I strode across the polished floor wearing the exact same vintage charcoal tweed suit I had worn on the night of the execution. Yet, The environment reacting to my presence was entirely different. The arrogant marketing executives and loud cryptocurrency promoters were completely gone, aggressively cleared out by Victoria's ruthless corporate restructuring team. The people who remained parted seamlessly as I walked past. They did not look through me anymore. Their eyes were lowered, filled with a quiet, palpable mixture of profound respect and a very healthy dose of absolute terror. They knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of destroying. I had retained the entire core engineering team, the quiet, exhausted young men and women whom Julian had constantly degraded and shoved into the backstage shadows. Yesterday morning, I officially increased all of their base salaries by 40%. I permanently established a working culture completely devoid of flashy yacht parties, empty buzzwords, and toxic vanity. From this moment forward, we were going to build real digital infrastructure, and everyone was going to be rewarded based entirely on pure, measurable merit. As I waited for the private glass elevator, I paused and glanced up at the massive flat television screen mounted on the lobby wall. A national news station was broadcasting live from the federal courthouse steps. Julian was being heavily escorted into the building by two armed federal marshals. He was wearing an oversized, wrinkled orange prison jumpsuit, his hands heavily cuffed in front of his waist. His perfectly styled hair was a matted mess, his face pale and completely hollowed out by the agonizing reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence. A small scrolling banner at the bottom of the news broadcast noted that Chloe had completely vanished from public life. Her massive digital empire had been entirely wiped from the internet. Her social media accounts permanently locked and seized by federal investigators as digital evidence. The elevator doors chimed softly and slid open. I stepped inside and rode up to the top floor in total silence. I walked into the expansive, glass-walled corner office that looked out over the sprawling, sunlit city of Austin. I did not sit on a cheap designer stool. I sank deeply into the heavy, genuine leather of the chief executive chair. I reached across the solid mahogany desk, picked up my ceramic mug, and took a slow, quiet sip of bitter black coffee. I let out a soft breath, smiled gently at the empty room, and opened my laptop to begin the morning sequence. The invisible ghost of the server room was dead. The true king of the empire had finally taken her throne. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's journey of revenge satisfying, I would be incredibly grateful if you could help support our channel with a donation of just $1. YouTube has unfortunately disabled our monetization, and your support is the only way we can pay our hardworking team so they can provide for their families and continue bringing you more powerful stories. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the secure link in the video description and pinned comment. Thank you again for your kindness, and I will see you in the next story.